What sits at the centre of the Dr Martin Whyte case is not one foolish tweet in 2018, but a pattern of institutional hesitation in the UK when anti-Semitism is presented in the language of irony, Palestine advocacy, or online repartee. A doctor wrote words that any ordinary British reader would recognise as Nazi taunts or Holocaust minimisation. Sieg Heil, gas the Jews, Holohoax, and the regulator concluded that this was grossly offensive but not quite enough to interrupt his medical career. That gap between obvious hatred in the words and the institutional reluctance in the sanction is exactly where many British Jews now live. It's the gap that produces anxiety. So starting with the substance, you do not have to be Jewish, Zionist, religious or pro-Israel to know that gas the Jews is not satire. It's a trigger phrase tied to the murder of families, not a clever online device, and the GMC panel itself accepted that the terms carry strong anti-Semitic connotations, yet, because the doctor explained that he was quoting, mocking or participating in a social media pile-on, the panel allowed intention to blur impact. That is one of the core problems in the UK conversation about anti-Semitism. We overprivilege the speaker's self-report and underweight the listener's experience. If a Jewish patient, parent or colleague reads that a paediatrician was joking about gassing Jews, their confidence is damaged at once. You do not need to prove his inner beliefs to know that trust has been harmed. The timing matters too. Since the 7th of October, there's been a sharp rise in reports from Jewish and Israeli medics about colleagues equating them with Israeli policy, sticking Palestine flags and watermelon badges on shared screens, or talking about Gaza to the only person in the room wearing a kippah. Those incidents tell you that many NHS workplaces have become the Israel-Palestine dispute have brought this dispute directly into professional life. The GMC's figures, hundreds of anti-Semitism complaints, most closed early, now sit alongside this case. Put together, they send a quiet message to Jewish doctors. Even very explicit anti-Semitic language may not lead now to exclusion from practice. That is why the campaign against anti-Semitism called it another spectacular failure, which it is. They're not being theatrical. They were reading the institutional signal. At the heart of this confusion, sometimes deliberate, between criticizing Israel and talking about Jews, that is the big problem. It's highlighted by the by the big Labour problem under Corbyn. It is perfectly lawful to criticize Israel, to oppose settlements, to condemn military activity in Gaza, to support Palestinian self-determination, but Jew banker goblins is not criticism of a government. Holohoax is not a comment on occupation. Gas the Jews is not foreign policy analysis. These are statements about Jews as Jews, and the problem is that parts of the British public life have become so used to heated debate about Israel that they have lost their ear for when the target has shifted from a state to a people. In this case, the regulator appears to have heard it as part of the Israel row when it should have been heard as prejudice, pure prejudice. There's a second layer. The doctor was not an obscure troll. He has been active in the BMA, involved in junior doctors' industrial action, visible online. In other words, he understood that professional standing depends on public trust. The GMC itself quoted good medical practice. You must make sure that your conduct justifies your patient's trust in you and the public's trust in your profession. Having identified a breach of that very standard, it still stopped short of suspension. So Jewish medics look at that and ask the obvious question: would this have been called satire if the target had been black people, Muslims, or LGBTQ patients? If not, why is satire? Why is it satire when it is Jews who are being attacked? This leads to the wider unease. Jewish doctors and nurses have been reporting that Palestinian symbols are permitted in clinical areas, that staff who complain are told not to make a fuss, and that some colleagues now talk about the Jews when what they actually mean is the Israeli government. Add to that several high-profile GMC cases on Israel and Hamas where outcomes were slow or light, and you have the ingredients of mistrust. It is not hysteria, it is pattern recognition. People who grew up hearing family stories about polite English anti-Semitism, the school that suddenly had no places left, the club that was full, are very quick to spot institutional double standards. And the case also shows how online culture is being misread by regulators. Twitter banter is fast, sarcastic, sometimes cruel. But professionals are still professionals when they are online. The GMC actually said that is part of its guidance. To say that is just how people talk on X is to forget the only question that matters in regulation. Does this conduct lower public confidence? Of course it does. A Jewish parent whose child is admitted to a ward has not been able to trust or has to be able to trust not just the doctor's clinical skill, but the doctor's basic human regard. You cannot separate those. There is finally a political context in the narrow sense of Jewish life in Britain today. Synagogues have more guards. Children travel to Jewish schools on unmarked buses. People take off their Magen David necklaces on the tube. Anti-Israel marches often feature openly anti-Semitic placards. In that environment, an official body choosing the lightest meaningful disposal for gas the Jews lands with a thud, doesn't it? It says, we know this hurts you, but we will manage it administratively. That is not what equal protection looks like. So what should have happened? A regulator that wanted to restore confidence could have said three clear things. First, that language linked to genocide of Jews is categorically incompatible with professional standing, whatever the poster's intention. Second, that in a period of heightened fear for British Jews, regulators will apply the IHRA definition rigorously to set the floor of acceptable conduct. Third, that criticism of Israel remains protected, but only when it is clearly about the state, not about Jews as a people. That would have separated legitimate speech from racist mockery and would have reassured Jewish clinicians that they are not standing alone. Dr. Whyte's case is not a single doctor being silly online. It's a stress case of where the British institutions recognise anti-Semitism, where it wears internet clothing, and when it travels close to hostility to Israel. On this occasion, the GMC identified the offence, named it gross, and then declined to match the penalty to the gravity. That is why Jewish doctors feel nervous. That is why Jewish patients will quietly ask for someone else. That is why the regulator's odd decision has become a symbol of something larger than one man's bad joke.